The offer in the dark, the market was almost empty now. Night had fallen, and the air was cold. Most traders had packed their stalls and gone home. Leaving only the sound of the wind between the tents, Cale, a human trader, was counting the few coins he had made that day. It had not been a good day, but it was enough for him to eat. He was about to close his stall when he heard soft footsteps behind him. He turned and saw her. An alien woman stood there, holding a small child in her arms. Her clothes were torn, her face pale, and her eyes filled with fear. The child's head rested weakly on her shoulder, her tiny hands gripping her mother's worn dress. Cale had seen hunger before, but this was different. This was desperation. The kind that came from running too long, hiding too long, and losing too much. The woman stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I have nothing left. Except my body," she whispered. "Please feed my daughter tonight. My body is yours, human." For a moment, Cale did not move. The words hung in the air, cold and heavy, around them. A few traders still packing their goods turned to watch. Some smirked, some whispered cruel things to each other. Cale felt their eyes on him, waiting to see if he would accept her offer. It made his stomach twist. The woman looked down, ashamed. Her daughter's eyes fluttered open for a moment, then closed again from exhaustion. Cale could see her small ribs through her thin clothes. It was clear the girl had not eaten for days, maybe longer. "Come with me," Cale said quietly. The woman hesitated, unsure. Some in the crowd laughed as Cale stepped away from his stall. He ignored them and walked toward his tent, glancing back to see if she would follow. Slowly, she did, clutching her daughter close. Inside his tent, it was warmer. A small lantern glowed in the corner, lighting the simple space, a bedroll, a low table, a crate with a few supplies. Cale took a small pot from the crate and poured broth into a bowl. He handed it to the woman. But she didn't eat. Instead, she gave it to her daughter, letting the little one sip slowly. The girl's eyes brightened slightly as the warmth filled her. Cale watched silently. "You're not going to eat?" he asked. The woman shook her head. "She needs it more than I do." Her voice was quiet, almost too quiet. Cale took another bowl and filled it, setting it in front of her. "Eat," he said firmly. She looked at him, certain, as if waiting for him to demand payment before she touched the food. When she finally took a small sip, her hands were shaking. Cale sat back and studied her. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then whispered, "Sarah, and her?" Cale nodded toward the child. "Leary," Sarah said softly. "She's all I have." Cale leaned back, feeling the weight of her words. He had seen many refugees pass through this market, but Sarah's eyes told a different story. There was something else there, something she was not saying. Sighed. The wind grew stronger. A flap of the tent moved with a gust, making Sarah's head snap toward it. Her reaction was too quick, too sharp. Cale noticed the way her hand tightened around her daughter. "You're afraid of something," he said slowly. Her lips pressed together. But she didn't answer. Cale didn't push. Not yet. Minutes passed, the only sound being Leary's slow eating. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice low. "They're looking for me," she said. "And if they find me, they will take me." Cale's eyes narrowed. "Who?" But before she could answer, the sound of boots outside the tent made them both freeze. The footsteps stopped right outside. A shadow moved across the tent wall. Cale reached for the small rifle beside his bedroll. Sarah's grip on her daughter tightened even more. Then, after a long moment, the shadow moved away, and the sound of boots faded into the night. Sarah closed her eyes, a shiver running through her. Cale knew one thing for certain now. This was more than hunger, and if he kept them here, trouble was going to follow. But looking at the frail child and the mother who was ready to give herself away to keep her alive, Cale also knew something. Else he was not going to let them face it alone. The night outside was cold and silent, inside the tent. The faint glow of the lantern cast soft shadows across the walls. Cale sat across from Sarah and her daughter, watching them quietly. Leary's small hands held the bowl tightly as if someone might snatch it away. She sipped the broth slowly, her eyes half closed, savoring each drop. Cale noticed Sarah was still not eating. Her bowl sat untouched, steam curling into the air. "You should eat," Cale said, his tone gentle but firm. Sarah's eyes flickered to his, then quickly looked away. "She needs it more than I do," she murmured. Cale leaned forward. "And she needs you alive." The words made Sarah pause. After a moment, she picked up the spoon and took a small bite, but it was clear. She was not used to anyone telling her to take care of herself. The silence in the tent was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Cale could feel the tension around Sarah like a wall. It was more than shyness, it was caution. Every movement, every glance from her was measured, like she was always ready to run. He wondered how long she had been living this way, and how. Many times she had been forced to choose between dignity and survival when Leary finished the bowl. She leaned against her mother, eyes already drifting shut. Cale reached for a small blanket and handed it over. Sarah hesitated before taking it, her fingers brushing his for just a second. Her skin was cold, almost trembling. "Thank you," she said softly, as if the words were strange to her. Cale nodded, but he noticed the way her gaze kept shifting to the tent flap. It was the same fear he had seen earlier, and it hadn't faded. "You keep looking at the door," Cale said. Sarah's lips pressed together, her eyes lowering to the ground. "Old habit," she replied. But her voice lacked conviction. Cale didn't push, not yet. He knew sometimes silence made people speak more than questions ever could. Minutes passed, the soft crackle of the lantern. The only sound, finally, Sarah spoke, her words barely above a whisper. "They watch the market. They wait for women like me." Cale's jaw tightened. "They." "The collectors," she said, and even the name seemed to drain the warmth from the air. "They take women and children, sell them." Cale had heard of them before, slavers who operated in the shadows, dealing in lives like they were goods. It explained everything, her fear, her desperation, even her offer to him earlier. "They won't touch you while you're here," Cale said, his voice steady. Sarah gave a bitter smile. "They always find a way." Her eyes dropped to her daughter, her hands smoothing Leary's hair gently. "I've kept her safe this long, but I can't keep running forever." Cale leaned back, staring at the tent ceiling for a moment. Part of him wanted to tell her to leave before trouble found its way to his door. But another part, the part that remembered the look in her eyes when she asked for food, refused to let her go back into the cold alone. He had seen too much cruelty in the galaxy to add to it by turning her away. "Rest here tonight," he said at last. "You don't have to." Sarah began, but Cale cut her off. "I said rest." The firmness in his tone made her blink. Then she gave a small nod. She lay down beside her daughter, pulling the blanket around both of them. For a long while, Cale just sat there, listening to the steady breathing of the child and the restless shifting of the mother. At one point, Sarah spoke again, her voice so quiet it was almost lost to the wind outside. "Why didn't you take what I offered?" Cale turned his head toward her. "Because no one should have to give themselves to feed their child," he said simply. Her eyes searched his face as if trying to see if he was lying, but there was only truth in his voice. Slowly, she lay back down. But Cale thought he saw the faintest shimmer of tears in her eyes before she turned away. Outside, the market was completely silent now. But Cale knew the collectors could be anywhere. Watching from the shadows, he checked his rifle one more time, setting it within reach. If they came tonight, they would not find her undefended. He didn't know why he cared so much for someone he had just met, but something about Sarah and the way she held her daughter like she was her whole world stirred something deep in him. The lantern light dimmed as the oil burned low. Cale stayed awake, his eyes fixed on the tent flap. Every whisper of wind made him tense. But the night passed without intrusion. When the first pale light of dawn crept into the tent, Cale finally let out a slow breath. They had made it through the night, but in his gut, he knew the danger had only begun. The sun rose slowly over the market, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. The air was still cold, and the early traders moved quietly, setting up their stalls inside Cale's tent. The faint warmth from the night's lantern had faded. Sarah sat awake, holding Leary close, her eyes distant. Cale was cooking a small pot of porridge, the steam curling up into the cool morning air. "You didn't sleep," Cale said, without looking up. Sarah shook her head. "I can't." Her voice was flat, tired. Cale didn't press her, but he could see the way her hands trembled as she brushed Leary's hair back. It wasn't just exhaustion, it was fear still clinging to her like a shadow. Leary stirred in her mother's arms, blinking sleepily. When Cale offered her a wooden spoon filled with porridge, she smiled faintly before taking a bite. Her smile was small, but it made Sarah's expression soften for a moment. It was clear the little girl was Sarah's anchor, the reason she was still standing at all after they ate. Cale sat on the low stool near the entrance, watching the market outside. "Who were you running from?" he asked at last. Sarah froze, her eyes locked on the ground. "I told you." "The collectors," she said. Cale shook his head. "Not just them. There's something else." Her lips pressed together, but her silence was answer enough. Cale leaned forward. "If I'm going to protect you, I need to know." For a long moment, Sarah said nothing. Then she sighed, the sound heavy with years of pain. "They came for me once before," she began, her voice low. "I was taken from my home, chained like an animal, sold to a man who treated me worse than dirt." Her hands tightened around Leary. "I escaped. But not alone." Cale could hear the catch in her breath. "My husband, he got us out." "But he didn't survive the run." Cale's chest tightened. "I've been moving from place to place ever since," Sarah continued, "never staying long, never letting anyone get close." Her eyes flicked to his, until last night. There was something in her gaze, not trust, not yet, but the first spark of it. Cale nodded slowly. "You're safe here," he said. But even as he said the words, he knew they were not entirely true. The sound of boots crunching on dirt came from outside. Cale's body tensed instantly through the gap in the tent flap. He saw a man approaching, tall, broad, with a scar running down his cheek. The man stopped just outside and called in a low, mocking voice. "Cale, you've got something that doesn't belong to you." Sarah went pale. Clutching Leary so tightly, the child whimpered. Cale stepped outside, rifle in hand. The man smiled coldly, his eyes sliding toward the tent. "She's ours," he said. "She ran away from a contract. And that little girl too. Both are valuable." Cale's jaw tightened. "She's not property," he said evenly. The man's smile widened. "Everything's property if the price is right." Other traders in the market were watching now, pretending to go about their business, but clearly listening. Cale took a slow step forward, placing himself fully between the man and the tent. "You're going to walk away," Cale said. The man chuckled. "We'll be back tonight, human. And we'll take what's ours without another word." He turned and left. Disappearing into the maze of market stalls, Cale stood there for a moment, the cold morning air biting at his skin. When he went back inside, Sarah's eyes were wide. With panic, "They'll come back," she whispered. "They always come back." Cale knelt in front of her. "Then we'll be ready." She shook her head. "No, you don't understand. They don't stop, Cale. They will follow us until we're caught or dead." Cale's mind was already racing, If they were coming tonight, he had only hours to prepare. He would need to make the tent look empty, set traps in the alleys, and be ready for a fight. But as he looked at Sarah and Leary, he knew he could not just defend, he had to end the threat. This was not going to be another night of hiding. It was going to be a night where the hunters learned what it meant to become prey. Still, a small voice in the back of his mind reminded him that these men were not lone scavengers. The collectors were part of a larger network. If he killed them, there might be more coming, but if he didn't, Sarah and Leary would never be safe. The choice was already made in his heart, even if his head was still weighing the danger. He looked at Sarah again. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with quiet defiance. She had been running for years. Yet here she was, still standing, still fighting for her child. Cale respected that more than he could say. And he knew he could not let that strength be crushed by the men who had hunted her for so long. "Stay inside tonight," he told her. "No matter what you hear." She opened her mouth to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then Sarah nodded once, holding her daughter close, and Cale stepped out into the brightening market, already planning for the battle to come. The market was busier by midday, but Cale felt the weight of every passing face. He kept one hand near the grip of his rifle, scanning for the scarred man or any sign of his gang. Sarah and Leary stayed inside the tent, hidden behind the crates and blankets Cale had piled near the entrance. From time to time, Cale glanced back to make sure they were still safe. But in his gut, he knew the danger was only hours away. By afternoon, whispers were already spreading. A human trader had defied the collectors. Some said Cale was a fool. Others said he wouldn't live to see another sunrise. Cale ignored them. But every whisper reminded him of the scarred man's words, "We'll be back tonight." Just as he was closing his stall, the scarred man returned. This time, he didn't come alone. 3 others followed him, their faces hard, their weapons visible. Cale stepped into the open, blocking the way to his tent. The scarred man smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Cale," he said slowly, "do you know how much she's worth?" Cale didn't answer. The man chuckled. "A rare heritage female. Unmarked, young enough to still bear children. Her price could buy a small ship." His eyes glinted with greed. "And the little one?" "Buyers pay double for mother and child together." Cale's grip on his rifle tightened. "You're not taking them," he said flatly. The man's smile faded. "You think you can stop us? We have ships, contacts, buyers across 5 systems. And all you have is one gun." Cale stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "Maybe. But right now, you're standing close enough for me to end you before you blink." One of the other men shifted uneasily, but the scarred man didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in slightly. "You're not protecting her because you care. You're protecting her because you want her for yourself." The accusation made Cale's jaw clench. He didn't respond, not because it was true, but because giving the man any reaction would be a mistake. The scarred man's voice grew colder. "Tonight. We're taking her, human." With that, he turned and walked away. His men following, Cale watched them go, every muscle in his body tense. He knew they would come back under the cover of darkness. He also knew they would come ready for a fight, inside the tent. Sarah was pacing. When Cale entered, she stopped, her eyes searching his face. "They came again," she guessed. Cale nodded. "They'll be here tonight." Sarah's hands tightened into fists. "You should let us go," she said. "They'll kill you over me." Cale shook his head. "If you leave, they'll catch you in less than an hour. At least here, you have a chance." Her voice trembled. "Why are you doing this?" "We barely know each other." Cale met her gaze. "Because I've seen what men like them do. And I'm not letting it happen to you or your daughter." Something in his tone made her stop arguing. She sat down, pulling Leary close. Cale could see the way she was fighting to keep her composure. He respected that she wasn't breaking. Even now, the hours passed slowly as Cale prepared. He set up tripwire alarms in the alleys, hid sharp metal spikes under loose sand, and positioned a small cache of ammunition near the tent flap. Every few minutes, he checked the horizon for signs of movement. Sarah stayed quiet, watching him. Work. Leary had fallen asleep again, her small hand curled in her mother's dress. As the sun began to set, the air grew colder, the market emptied. Traders leaving for safer districts before nightfall. Cale loaded his rifle and set it beside the bedroll. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it, the moment when talk would end and action would decide everything. Sarah broke the silence, her voice barely audible. If something happens to you, what should I do? Cale didn't hesitate. Run, gate, Leary, and follow the back path out of the market. There's an old water tower beyond the ridge. Hide there until morning. She nodded slowly, but he could see the fear in her eyes. He didn't tell her the truth that if things went badly, they might not have time to run at all. Darkness settled quickly. The wind outside carried faint sounds, the creak of wood. The shift of sand. Cale crouched near the entrance. Rifle ready, every shadow looked like movement, every whisper of air like approaching footsteps. Sarah sat in the corner, clutching Leary, her eyes never leaving the tent flap. And then, just as the moonlight touched the ground outside, Cale heard it, the faint crunch of boots on dirt, coming closer, slow and deliberate. The collectors had arrived. Cale's heartbeat slowed. His finger resting lightly on the trigger, he could see their silhouettes now. 4 men. Spreading out to surround the tent, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. But Cale didn't look back. His eyes were locked on the entrance. The price they had put on Sarah's head was high. But tonight, Cale intended to make sure it cost them far more than they expected. The night air was sharp and cold. The moon hung low, casting pale light over the empty market. Cale crouched just inside the tent entrance, his rifle steady. He could hear the soft crunch of boots approaching from 3 different directions. They were moving slow, trying to be quiet. But Cale could read the rhythm of their steps. They thought they were hunting him, but they were already walking into his plan. Earlier that day, Cale had mapped the alleys and paths around the tent. He had laid tripwires, hidden sharp spikes under loose sand, and set small charges in crates near the stalls. The collectors wouldn't expect it. Most traders never fought back. That was Cale's advantage. He wasn't just defending, he was drawing them in. Sarah sat in the corner of the tent, clutching Leary. The girl was asleep, her face buried in her mother's arms. Sarah's eyes never left Cale's back. Her breathing was quiet, but he could feel the tension in the air between them. She wanted to speak, maybe to beg him to stop. As she stayed silent, she knew this moment could decide everything. The first shadow appeared at the edge of the tent. A man leaned forward. Scanning the inside, Cale didn't move. He waited until the man's boot caught the first tripwire. There was a sharp metallic snap, followed by a grunt of pain. The man stumbled. And in that instant, Cale fired. The shot echoed through the night, dropping the man before he could cry out. The silence shattered. Shouts rang out from the other sides of the tent. 2 more men rushed in, weapons raised. Cale ducked and rolled to the side, pulling the pin on a small flash charge he had hidden. Under the table, it exploded in a burst of blinding light. The men staggered, covering their eyes. Cale fired twice more, each shot finding its mark, outside. The scarred man was shouting orders. Cale could hear his voice moving closer. "You're worth more alive, Sarah." The man called, his tone mocking. Cale smirked under his breath. If they wanted her alive, that gave him a little more room to act. Suddenly, there was a sound of wood snapping near the back of the tent. The fourth man had tried to come in from behind. Cale grabbed the small detonator from his belt and pressed it. A hidden crate in the alley blew open, scattering debris and sending the man sprawling into the sand. Cale was on him in seconds, slamming the butt of his rifle into his head. But in that moment, Cale made the mistake of looking toward Sarah. The scarred man had slipped inside, his blade pressed against her neck. Sarah's eyes were wide, but her jaw was set. "Drop the gun, human," the man growled. Cale froze, his mind racing. He could shoot, but the risk to Sarah was too high. Slowly, Cale lowered his weapon. The scarred man grinned. "That's better. Now, step away." Cale's eyes narrowed. "You're not walking out of here with her," Kay said quietly. The man laughed. "I already am." In that split second, Cale shifted his stance. His boot nudged the corner of a rug, the one covering a pit trap he had dug earlier. Cale lunged forward, grabbing Sarah and pulling her aside just as the man stepped into the wrong spot. The ground gave way beneath him, and he fell with a sharp cry, landing hard on the spikes below. The tent was silent again, except for the faint groans of the man in the pit. Cale held Sarah for a moment. Feeling her heartbeat pounding against his chest, she pulled back, her eyes locked on his. "You planned all this," she whispered. Cale nodded once. "I don't fight to lose," but his voice was grim. He knew this wasn't over. The collectors were part of something bigger, and this small victory would only buy them time. Still, for tonight, Sarah and Leary were safe. Cale reloaded his rifle and glanced toward the dark alleys. If anyone else was coming, they'd be met with the same welcome. Sarah knelt beside Leary, brushing the girl's hair from her face. When she looked back at Cale, there was something new in her eyes, not just gratitude, but trust beginning to take root. Cale saw it, and it made the long night ahead feel a little less heavy. The trap had worked, but he knew the real fight had only just begun. The air inside the tent was heavy with the smell of smoke and dust. Cale stood at the entrance, his rifle still warm from the fight. The scarred man groaned in the pit, his voice weak but full of hate. Sarah kept Leary close, rocking her gently, but her eyes never left Cale. It was as if she was afraid he might fall down at any second. Cale's side burned where a blade had grazed him during the fight. The wound wasn't deep, but it was bleeding steadily. He pressed his hand against it, willing himself to stay upright. Outside, faint footsteps crunched over the sand. Cale's muscles tensed. More were coming. 3 silhouettes appeared at the edge of the market, moving fast. They weren't the same men from earlier. These were heavier armed. One carried a long rifle. The other 2 had curved blades glinting in the moonlight. Sarah's grip on her daughter tightened until her knuckles went white. Cale's eyes narrowed. The first man fired without warning. The shot tore through the tent wall, missing Cale by inches. Cale dropped to one knee and returned fire, the recoil jolting through his injured side. One man went down, but the other 2 charged in with blades. Cale blocked the first strike with his rifle, slamming the butt into the attacker's jaw. The second swung low, cutting across Cale's thigh. Pain shot through him, but he stayed on his feet. Sarah screamed as one of the men lunged toward her. Without thinking, Cale threw himself in front of the blow. The blade sliced deep into his shoulder, his vision blurred. But he grabbed the man's wrist and twisted hard until he dropped the weapon. In the same motion, Sarah grabbed a fallen dagger and drove it into the man's side. The attacker collapsed, clutching the wound. The last man hesitated, seeing 2 of his companions on the ground. Cale leveled his rifle and fired. The shot echoed across the empty market, leaving only the sound of Cale's ragged breathing. Sarah dropped the dagger, her hands trembling. Cale glanced at her. She was pale, but there was a strange fire in her eyes. She had fought back, not just run. Cale staggered back to the bedroll, lowering himself carefully. Sarah moved toward him, her hands hovering. Unsure where to touch. You're bleeding too much, she said, her voice shaking. Cale gave a faint, tired smile. I've had worse. But when she pressed a cloth to his shoulder, he winced. Sarah's hands were gentle but firm. Refusing to let him pull away, you didn't have to do that, she whispered. You could have let them take me and kept yourself alive. Cale looked at her, his voice low but steady. I told you. You're not property. Her eyes glistened with tears. No one's ever said that to me before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was broken only by the quiet breathing of Leary. Still asleep despite the chaos outside, the wind shifted, carrying away the smell of blood. Cale's head began to feel heavy, the edges of his vision dimming. You need to rest, Sarah said. Guiding him down onto the bedroll, he didn't resist. His strength was fading fast. As he lay there, Cale thought about the fight, about the way Sarah had stood her ground, about how the scarred man's threat had turned into this desperate battle. He knew the collectors wouldn't give up, but tonight they had lost, and that loss would make them think twice before coming again so soon. Sarah sat beside him. Watching his breathing slow, she brushed a strand of hair from his forehead, her fingers lingering for a moment. You saved us, she said softly, as if saying it out loud made it more real. Cale's lips curved into a faint smile. Not just tonight. As long as I can stand, I'll keep saving you. His eyes closed, and sleep pulled him under. Sarah stayed awake, listening to the night outside. Every creak of the market's wooden stalls made her tense. But no more footsteps came. No more shadows moved across the tent wall. For the first time in years, she felt a fragile sense of safety. It was thin, fragile as glass, but it was there when dawn broke. The light spilling into the tent was warm and golden. Cale stirred, opening his eyes slowly. Sarah was still there. Her daughter curled against her side. She looked tired, but her eyes were clear. They had survived the night, but deep inside, Sarah knew the fight for their freedom was not over. It was only just beginning. The morning light spilled through the thin fabric of the tent, soft and golden. Outside, the market was waking slowly, the quiet clatter of crates and low murmur of voices drifting in. Cale sat up with effort, his shoulder and side aching from the night before. Sarah was beside him instantly, steadying him with one hand while keeping Leary cradled in the other. You shouldn't move yet, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Cale looked at her, at the exhaustion in her eyes and the faint tremble in her hands. You stayed awake all night, he said. She gave a small shrug. I didn't want them coming back and finding you asleep. Cale smiled faintly at that, a tired warmth in his expression. You're braver than you think, he told her. Sarah looked away, but he saw the smallest flicker of pride in her eyes. Leary stirred and opened her eyes, blinking at the sunlight, when she saw Cale sitting up. She wriggled out of her mother's arms and climbed into his lap. Cale winced at the pressure, but didn't move her. Instead, he let her lean against him, small arms wrapping around his waist. It was the first hug he had received in longer than he could remember. Outside, the market buzzed with cautious talk. Word had already spread of the fight, how one human had taken on the collectors and lived. Some traders avoided Cale's tent entirely, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. Others looked at him with new respect, even a hint of fear. Cale didn't care for either. All that mattered now was keeping Sarah and Leary safe. Sarah was quiet, as she prepared a small breakfast from what little they had left. She handed Cale a bowl and hesitated before sitting across from him. I still have nothing to give you, she said softly. Not even a coin. Cale met her eyes. I never wanted payment, he said. Food and safety aren't something you should have to buy with your body. Her gaze dropped. But this time it wasn't from shame. It was from emotion she couldn't hide. They ate in silence for a while, but it wasn't the tense silence of before. It felt calmer, like the walls Sarah had built around herself were starting to lower. When Leary finished, she curled back up in the blanket. Drifting into another nap, Cale leaned back, wincing at the pull in his shoulder. He knew the collectors wouldn't let this go, but he also knew that letting Sarah and Leary run again would be the same as handing them over. "We can't stay in the market forever," he said at last. Sarah looked at him warily. "You mean leave?" Cale nodded. "There's a settlement 2 days east. More people, more eyes. Harder for the collectors to work in the open." Sarah hesitated. "You'd come with us?" she asked. Cale gave a small smile. "I'm not letting you walk." "Into danger alone?" For a moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned forward slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've done more for me in 2 nights than anyone's done in my whole life." Cale felt the weight of her words settle between them. He didn't answer with promises, only with a steady look that told her he meant to keep protecting her. The rest of the day passed in quiet preparation. Cale cleaned his rifle, checked his supplies, and traded what little stock he had left for food and water for the road. Sarah found some fabric scraps and stitched a small satchel for Leary's things. It wasn't much, but it was more than they'd had before. The simple act of packing together felt like the first step toward something better. That night, they didn't sleep in fear. They still kept the lantern lit and the rifle close, but the silence outside wasn't filled with the same dread. Cale lay on his bedroll, listening to the soft breathing of Sarah and Leary. For the first time, he allowed himself to think that maybe there could be more than just surviving. When morning came, the 3 of them stepped out into the cool dawn air. The market was already alive with voices. But Cale noticed people moving aside as they passed. Some looked at Sarah with curiosity, others with quiet judgment. Cale ignored them all. Sarah kept her head high, her daughter's hand firmly in hers, as they walked away from the market. The rising sun painted the horizon in warm gold. Cale felt the weight of the past days on his shoulders, but also a strange lightness. They didn't know what dangers lay ahead, but they weren't running alone anymore. And for Sarah, for Leary, and maybe even for himself, Cale was ready to face whatever came next. Somewhere deep inside, Sarah knew that this was more than just leaving a market behind. It was the first step toward a life where her daughter could grow without fear, where she herself could stand without chains around her soul. She glanced at Cale, and for the first time, she smiled a real smile. Under the brightening sky, their journey began. A new beginning, fragile but full of hope.